Can you get decent history from a Disney movie? That was one of my questions as I sat down to watch two of this famous company's films released back in the 1990s as research for this video on the life of the real Pocahontas. Pocahontas was a Native American princess who rose to prominence in the early 17th century, and in today's video from History Calling, I'm going to take a Hollywood versus history approach by comparing her life story, as told by Disney, to what we know of her from the real historical record. So be warned, there are spoilers for the two movies. Now, who was the real Pocahontas, and did her story actually have an ending worthy of a Disney film? Let's find out. The movie Pocahontas was released in 1995 and was based on the life of a real American princess. In the film, we meet the titular character, who is the daughter of the Native American chief Powhatan. She is portrayed as a free-spirited young woman, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s. The movie also incorporates magic, most notably in the character of Grandmother Willow, a talking tree which guides Pocahontas. Pocahontas' father wants her to marry Kocoum, and my apologies by the way if I'm getting the pronunciation of anything wrong, but she finds him too serious. Meanwhile, English colonists under the command of a Governor Ratcliffe have arrived in what is now Virginia and founded Jamestown, an event which occurred in reality in 1607. It's therefore completely inaccurate when we get a shot of the Union Jack flag, as it didn't actually exist yet. Among their number is the dashing Captain John Smith, who soon meets Pocahontas and is able to communicate with her through magic. Though they don't get along initially as he insults her people, after she shows him the magic of the forest, they fall in love. When the colonists and the Native Americans begin to fight with one another, the couple hope to stop the hostilities and be together. And when Pocahontas' fiancé finds out about their relationship and sees them, he attacks John Smith and is shot dead by one of Smith's comrades. Smith ends up being taken prisoner, and there is about to be an all-out war between the English and the tribe. Pocahontas saves John from execution though and secures his release, and when Governor Ratcliffe tries to shoot her father, John throws himself in front of the bullet. The governor is arrested for trying to instigate a war, there is peace between the Native Americans and the colonists, and John decides he needs to go back to England to finish healing from his wounds. He bids farewell to Pocahontas and leaves. This is where the film ends. The second film, released in 1998, picks up some time later, with John back in England where he is attacked by soldiers seeking his arrest and seemingly killed. Governor Ratcliffe is trying to manipulate the king, James I, into declaring war on Pocahontas' tribe, and so James sends a man named John Rolfe to Virginia to bring back the chief to negotiate a peace. By the way, I always get a kick out of this cartoon rendering of James I, and props to the artists, as you can see that they have tried to base it on the real man. When her father refuses to go, Pocahontas travels to England in his place to try to secure a lasting peace. After a rocky start, she and John Rolfe soon bond, but things are difficult in England. James wants Pocahontas to appear, quote, civilised at a ball he is throwing, otherwise he will send an armada to the Americas, and so she has to suppress much of her heritage and looks by observing English etiquette, using makeup to lighten her skin tone, and dressing in English clothes, which look curiously Victorian instead of Stuart-esque. Just compare them to the more accurate clothing that the Queen, Anne of Denmark, is wearing. She nearly wins over the King and Queen, who oddly enough both have English accents despite being a Scot and a Dane, but then she flies off the handle and calls James savage because of a bear baiting he enjoys watching. As a punishment, she and her bodyguard, Uti, are locked up in the Tower of London. It is now revealed that John Smith is still alive, and he and John Rolfe break Pocahontas and Uti out of prison. Pocahontas succeeds in proving to King James that Ratcliffe is a liar who has been trying to create a war for his own ends. He wants to steal the gold he believes her tribe has, and the armada is stopped and Ratcliffe arrested. John Smith wants Pocahontas to sail off into the sunset with him, but she decides to stay with John Rolfe, and the film ends with the new couple sailing back to Jamestown to live their lives there together. It's all very Disney, as you might expect, but how much of it is true? The real Pocahontas was born in about 1596, we'll discuss her age a little more later on, and was the daughter of Chief Powhatan, also known as Wahunsonacock. Again, apologies for what I'm sure is my terrible pronunciation. We know nothing about her mother. Her real name seems to have been either Matoaka or Amonute, with Pocahontas being a nickname given to her to reflect her personality, because it means playful. The Disney film's depiction of her adventurous character therefore seems accurate enough. Her father had around 20 children from multiple wives, but she was one of his favourites, referred to as his most dear and well-beloved daughter by Captain John Smith. In late April 1607, when the English settlers, including Smith, arrived in modern-day Virginia and founded Jamestown, then known as James's Fort, she was therefore only a child of around 11, rather than the adult we see in the Disney movies. In reality, there was never any suggestion of a romantic relationship between her and Smith, who was a grown man of 27, having been baptised and presumably also born in 1580. The colonists also included the villain of the Disney movies, John Ratcliffe, but there's nothing to suggest he reacted to the tribe any differently than the others or was a special threat to them. It is John Smith's writings, as well as those of another, slightly later settler called William Strachey, who arrived at the fort in 1609, which provide us with our information about Pocahontas' life in Virginia. Smith wrote an account of his time there from his arrival up to June 1608, which was published back in London later that year under the title A True Relation of Virginia. He later published a book detailing his experiences in 1624 entitled The General History of Virginia, New England and the Summer Isles. Shortly after his arrival at the fort, Strachey became the secretary of the Virginia Company in the colony. This company, full name the Virginia Company of London, was founded in England in 1606 and had organised and funded the colonisation project. Upon arrival, the original settlers had then set up a governing body for themselves under its auspices. In 1611-12, after returning to England, Strachey wrote a book called The History of Travel into Virginia, Britannia, though it didn't appear in print until 1849. This does include his eyewitness experiences of living in James's Fort and interacting with Pocahontas and her tribe, but his entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography notes that his manuscript borrowed heavily from the work of earlier authors, including Richard Wills, James Rosier, and John Smith. Nevertheless, there is much to be gained regarding Pocahontas' life from reading his work, and it is from these two men that historians have pieced together the fragments of information we have about her age and family situation. It was only with the arrival of the colonists, however, and their interactions with the Powhatan tribe, that a more solid account of her life begins. Upon the English making landfall in Virginia, they had met with some Native Americans almost immediately, and although relations were hostile with some tribes, resulting in attacks on the newly built fort, in other cases there were trading activities and comparatively friendly contacts. In fact, had it not been for the help of some of the locals, none of the English settlers might have survived their first summer. Smith tells us that many died of sickness and others of starvation as their supplies ran low, and he and another survivor, Edmund Wingfield, who also published an account of his time in Virginia in 1608 called A Discourse of Virginia, agree that 40 to 50 men were dead by the end of September. The settlers were lousy farmers, and the locals had to provide them with food and lessons in how to live off the land in order to keep them going. Captain Ratcliffe was also elected the new president of the Virginia Company on the 10th of September, so the first movie's depiction of him as their leader is somewhat accurate, though he wasn't in command from the moment they landed. In December 1607, Smith was part of a trading company that left Jamestown to explore the land and try to acquire provisions from the local tribes. Along the way, he hired a canoe from some Native Americans and took 2 of them with him as guides, but was captured and ultimately found himself in front of Pocahontas' father. His account of what happened next varies. In his 1624 book, written when there was no one left who could dispute his tale, he said, "2 great stones were brought before Powhatan. Then as many as could laid hands on him, dragged him to them, and thereon laid his head, and being ready for their clubs to beat out his brains. Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, when no entreaty could prevail, got his head in her arms and laid her own upon his to save him from death. whereupon the emperor was contented he should live to make him hatchets and her bells, beads, and copper, for they thought him as well of all occupations as themselves. It's a great story, full of drama and even a hint of romance, and it makes Pocahontas look fantastic. But if we look at an earlier source, we can see that Smith's account has changed quite dramatically. In the version of his captivity written in 1608, so within months of it happening, there is no mention of Pocahontas or a near-death experience. Instead, Smith is received with kindness by the king and eventually released and sent back to Jamestown or James Fort, with 4 men to carry his gown and knapsack as well as bread that the chief had gifted him. I suspect this is the more accurate version of events, not affected by the hindsight Smith had in 1624 when Pocahontas had become famous. Furthermore, Edmund Wingfield also relates the story and makes no mention of her, instead saying that Smith was saved, quote, by the means of his guide, and made it back to the fort on the 8th of January. Nevertheless, the story that she saved John has become part of the Pocahontas myth and has a prominent role in the Disney movie and in other accounts of her life. If it did happen, it has been suggested that it was likely a kind of adoption ceremony, designed to make Smith part of the tribe and beholden to its chief, rather than kill him. Personally, I think he included the tale in his 1624 book because Pocahontas had become very well known by then, and stories of her youth in Virginia would have appealed to an English audience and improved sales of his work. After Smith's release in January 1608, Pocahontas became a frequent visitor to the fort, and the first mention he makes of her in 1608's A True Relation of Virginia, and therefore the first true look we ever get of her, relates to one of these trips. The encounter occurred that spring when her father sent her to James's fort because the colonists were holding some natives captive. The use of his beloved Pocahontas as an intermediary, who came bearing bread and a deer, was a diplomatic manoeuvre, meant to show Powhatan's love and respect, and it worked. Smith writes that after church one morning, these prisoners were given, quote, to Pocahontas, the king's daughter, in regard of her father's kindness in sending her. And having been well fed and had their weapons restored to them, off they went with the little princess, who was given such trifles as contented her. He describes her at this point as, quote, a child of 10 years old, which not only for feature, countenance, and proportion much exceedeth any of the rest of his, that's her father's people, but for wit and spirit the only non-parel, an old word meaning she was unrivalled, of his country. Smith's note on her age would put her birth in around 1598, but there are conflicting accounts of her years. In a letter he claims to have written to James I's wife, Anne of Denmark, about a decade later, for instance, he instead said Pocahontas was 12 or 13 at the time of his capture, which is, I think, a good example of how human memories can be fallible and change with time. Strachey, who you'll recall arrived in 1609 and stayed until 1611, concurred that she frequented the fort on numerous occasions, and described her as a well-featured but wanton young girl, Powhatan's daughter, sometimes resorting to our fort, at the age then of 11 or 12 years, get the boys forth with her into the marketplace, and make them wheel, falling on their hands, turning their heels upwards, whom she would follow, and wheel so herself, naked as she was, all the fort over. He noted too that the women of her tribe began, at the age of about 12, to cover themselves up and dress quite modestly. So this story of her cartwheeling around the fort only emphasises further that at the time of this anecdote, Pocahontas was very young and no more than 12. If we assume the passage I just read to you relates to 1609, that provides a birth year of no earlier than 1596, assuming she was 12 coming 13. It could date to 1611, however, which would mean she was born as late as 1600. Smith later claimed, though, that Pocahontas didn't willingly visit James's fort again after his own departure in 1610, which would mean that Strachey probably didn't see her after that date, though Smith may have been mistaken. This engraving, which was done in 1616 and is the only contemporary likeness we have of her, says she was 21 at that time, meaning she would have been born in 1594 or 1595. I find it's usually easier to accurately estimate the age of smaller children than of someone in their late teens or early 20s who has stopped growing, So I suspect she was a little on the younger side and born in around 1598, as this date would tally with both Smith and Strachey's initial observations, written down quite soon after their interactions with her. No matter what way you cut it though, Pocahontas was much younger than the cartoon version of her seen in the Disney movie, and though the tribe's children were free to run around undressed, as an adult she likely never wore anything as revealing as the one-shoulder, sweetheart neckline mini dress seen in those films. Both Smith and Strachey give further details about her life in the early days of the James Fort settlement. Smith later credited her with saving the colonists on more than one occasion, telling Queen Anne, and please forgive the offensive language here and remember these are Smith's words, not mine, "Such was the weakness of this poor commonwealth, as had the savages not fed us, we directly had starved. And this relief, most gracious Queen, was commonly brought us by this Lady Pocahontas, notwithstanding all these passages when inconstant fortune turned our peace to war, this tender virgin would still not spare to dare to visit us, and by her our jars have been oft appeased and our wants still supplied. Were it the policy of her father thus to employ her, or the ordinance of God thus to make her his instrument, or her extraordinary affection to our nation, I know not, but of this I am sure. When her father, with the utmost of his policy and power, sought to surprise me, having but 18 with me, the dark night could not affright her from coming through the irksome woods, and with watered eyes gave me intelligence with her best advice to escape his fury, which had he known he had surely slain her. Jamestown, with her wild train, she as freely frequented as her father's habitation, and during this time of 2 or 3 years, she, next under God, was still the instrument to preserve this colony from death, famine, and utter confusion. Again, bear in mind that Smith might have been exaggerating the importance of Pocahontas here, just as he seems to have done in relation to her involvement in his release from captivity, as she was, by the mid-late to 1610s, a famous Native American princess. Strachey tells us more about her personal life, saying that she was married for 2 years or longer to a Native American called Kocoum. This is obviously where the character of her quasi-fiancé in the film has come from, though in the movie they are never wed. We don't know what happened to this first husband, but by April 1613 she was apparently single again, and about to endure a major upheaval to her life, which began with a kidnapping. At that time, Pocahontas was either visiting or living with the Powhatan natives, and as John Smith's comments about her saving Jamestown from attacks by her father's men suggest, relations with the Native Americans were at a low ebb, and had been for some time. In fact, they were now engaged in the First Anglo-Powhatan War, which lasted from 1609 to 1614. Nevertheless, when a ship anchored nearby under the command of a Captain Samuel Argall, Pocahontas's Powhatan hosts, who had been bribed by Argall, were able to trick her into coming aboard. Once there, the captain would not let her leave, and instead took her to James's fort, then Henricus, named after Prince Henry, then heir to the English and Scottish throne, where she was held for ransom as the English sought to secure the release of prisoners held by Powhatan, as well as gain weapons and food. Her father did capitulate, and nearly 10 years of peace between the two sides followed. During her captivity, Pocahontas converted to Anglicanism, was baptized with the name Rebecca, and made serious headway in learning English. She also met the man who would become her next husband, John Rolfe. Far from being an emissary sent by James I to avert a war, as Disney would have us believe, Rolfe was an Englishman born in 1585 who had arrived in Virginia with his first wife in 1610. Sadly, she soon died, and by early 1614 he was looking to marry again, this time to Pocahontas. Disney present the couple's union as a love match, and this actually does seem to be true, though a 1614 letter which Rolfe wrote to the fort's acting governor, Sir Thomas Dale, seeking permission to marry her, indicates that there were other reasons for his choice. In it, he said he wished to wed her, quote, "for the good of this plantation, for the honour of our country, for the glory of God, for my own salvation, and for the converting to the true knowledge of God and Jesus Christ an unbelieving creature, namely Pocahontas, to whom my hearty and best thoughts are, and have a long time been so entangled and enthralled in so intricate a labyrinth, that I was even aweary to unwind myself thereout. But Almighty God, who never faileth his that truly invocate his holy name, hath opened the gate, and led me by the hand, that I might plainly see and discern the safe paths wherein to tread. He further explained that he was concerned about marrying a wife from a background so different to his, even wondering if his feelings for her, and he did say in the letter that he was in love with her, were the devil's work. However, he came to the conclusion that God wanted him to convert Pocahontas, and added that he was also mindful of her great appearance of love to me, her desire to be taught and instructed in the knowledge of God, her capableness of understanding, her aptness and willingness to receive any good impressions, and also the spiritual, besides her own incitements stirring me up hereunto. The two were married at the fort in April 1614, and in 1615 Pocahontas gave birth to their son, Thomas. Both events were groundbreaking, as this was the first marriage between a white European and a Native American, and as far as we know, Thomas was the first child to have mixed English and Native American heritage. Pocahontas and her family were trailblazers, with a union similar to the kind of dynastic marriages seen in European royal families, which were designed to bring together opposing groups and encourage peace between them. It is perhaps little surprise that the settlers soon came up with other ways that she and her new husband and child could be of use to them. The prospect of showing off a Native American princess who had converted to their faith, learnt their language, and married one of their countrymen was seen as an excellent way to entice new English settlers to go to Virginia, and the Virginia Company of London now ordered Sir Thomas Dale to send her to that city. Contrary to what we see in the second Disney movie, her trip there therefore had nothing to do with a diplomatic mission to prevent a Stuart armada being sent to subdue the Native Americans, nor was she an unmarried woman when she left. Instead, she was Mrs. Rebecca Rolfe, travelling with her husband and infant son as a kind of ambassador to encourage more colonists to make Virginia their new home, and to show that they didn't need to be concerned about interacting with its native people. When she arrived in June 1616, she was something of a sensation, and in this regard the second film does stick closer to the truth. She brought with her around a dozen Powhatans, and they were lodged in the Belle Savage on Ludgate Hill. The Oxford DMB gives a good summary of her activities. The Queen received her at Whitehall, the Bishop of London hosted a dinner in her honour at Lambeth Palace, King James treated her graciously at a masque by Ben Jonson, and the Dutch artist Simon de Passe engraved her portrait. It must have been an overwhelming experience, at least initially, for someone who had never seen a European town before, let alone something the size of London. You'll be pleased to hear there is no hint of the very difficult relationship with the king shown in the film. In fact, he ensured she was treated as a princess, and she certainly wasn't locked up in the Tower of London. In fact, she seems to have been a hit with everyone. English author Samuel Purchas, who saw her when the Bishop of London was entertaining her, later wrote in 1625 that she did not only accustom herself to civility, but still carried herself as the daughter of a king, and was accordingly respected, not only by the company, which allowed provision for herself and her son, but of divers particular persons of honour, in their hopeful zeal by her to advance Christianity. She will have worn English clothing, as you see from her portrait, and observed English etiquette, but she'd likely been doing that for years already, ever since her capture back in 1613. She also met up again with John Smith, who she had been told was dead. No doubt this is where the Disney scriptwriters got the idea to have the character of Smith seemingly killed at the beginning of the second movie. She declared herself happy to see him again, and asked that he call her child and she call him father. As popular as she was in England, however, her trip to the country was to prove her undoing. When the family set sail for Virginia in March 1617, which was apparently done much against Pocahontas's will, according to a letter from one John Chamberlain to Sir Dudley Carleton, they didn't get far. Perhaps she had grown to love England, perhaps she just knew she wasn't well enough to make the trip. Whatever the reason for her reticence, almost immediately the princess had to be taken ashore at Gravesend in Kent, and it was there that she died. We have no account of her symptoms, however, and so don't know what caused this. She was 22 at most, and I think more likely about 19. She was buried on the 21st of March in the chancel of St. George's Church, which you see here, and a statue was much later erected outside to her memory. It was no Disney ending, I'm afraid. Her husband wrote that her death was much lamented and softened only by the survival of their son. However, he left the boy with Sir Lewis Stockley in Plymouth and travelled on to Virginia alone. He told one correspondent that he feared for the toddler's health if he took him on board ship, but also worried about, quote, how I might be censured for leaving my child behind me. Indeed, the fact that he never returned for Thomas should not be taken as a sign that he didn't care for him. He wrote that Thomas's existence greatly extinguisheth the sorrow of her loss, and left him property in his will. The boy was later raised by his paternal uncle, Henry Rolfe. John Rolfe remarried in Virginia and had a daughter named Elizabeth in 1621, but he died the following year of an unknown illness. His former father-in-law, Powhatan, had died in 1618, just a year after his famous daughter. In his early 20s, Pocahontas' son, Thomas Rolfe, returned to the land of his birth and took up the tobacco trade which his father had been employed in. Through his marriage to Jane Poythress, which produced a single daughter, Pocahontas has many descendants, including her 12 times great-grandson, actor Edward Norton, who discovered his links to her in an episode of the TV show Finding Your Roots. Her bloodline continues then, despite the tragically early death of this real-life American princess. Given that the end to her story is quite depressing, if I've put you in the mood to go watch the Disney movies with their happier take on her life, you can find them using the links in the description box below. There are also links to an Amazon Prime free trial if you'd like to try that out so that you don't have to pay for the films. This video isn't sponsored by Amazon, but the links, like most of my product links, are affiliates, meaning I do get a commission if you purchase something or take out a free trial. This doesn't affect the price you pay. That brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you as always to those of you who support me on Patreon, where I provide extra perks including mini podcasts and early access to ad-free videos, or by making one-off donations using the thanks button underneath my videos. If you're in the mood for more of the same, why not try my American history playlist next, or my Hollywood versus history video on the execution of Anne Boleyn. Let me know in the comments too if you think movies should be able to rewrite history to the extent done in the Disney films about Pocahontas. And until next time, keep learning.